Good day to you, life, mystery, and soul detectives. I wanted to speak upon individuation. Individuation is a word that can have different definition depending on who, where, context. So when we're talking about individuation, we're not only speaking about a necessary need for independence in order to remain free and autonomous individuals, but also individuation in the Jungian psychotherapy world is really the be-all, end-all goal, which is to liberate ourselves from all inaccurate definitions, projections, inaccurate self-imaging that we have maybe taken on in the past and continues to exist in the present, although it may remain unconscious to us. So in Jungian terms, individuation is not merely jumping and skipping into being the unique individual that we are. It involves a huge journey and an exploration to the very core of our being. So to first discover not only who we are, but what got in the way of that, what original childhood interferences, traumas, religious conditioning, etc., has shaped us out of being what we originally were born to be. Now, individuation in evolutionary astrology is very similar. And evolutionary astrology is not simply an astrological technique. It is similar to Jungian psychology, an in-depth understanding of the soul, the unconscious, the parts and pieces of life, how it all works, and how we can better understand our consciousness, so to not fight against the grain of what life inevitably is. Inevitability is a word that is oftentimes brought up not only by quote-unquote astrologers, but anybody who thinks about life, as there are certain aspects of life which are inevitable, such as death, such as every human being having a conscious and an unconscious. It is inevitable that every human being has a shadow. And therefore, a part of the individuation process is about us becoming aware of the totality of who we are, including our quote-unquote shadow, which simply refers to the unconscious, which is easily the majority of the iceberg beneath the water. Carl Jung was one of the first early therapists to dive as deep as he possibly could into understanding the unconscious, which also brought him very deeply into the occult. And much of what he learned and discovered is true about consciousness and the unconscious was nothing new, was known about and understood by the ancients for thousands and thousands of years. That there is a process inherent within the human species, that there is a very purpose for our living and struggling within the human condition. And this is made extraordinarily concise through Jeffrey Green's work with evolutionary astrology. And generally, I recommend to all Pluto people, we need to know the grandfathers, the Renaissance men that have led us into understanding the human psyche and consciousness that we do in this age, because many of these men, and they all have mostly been men up until this point. This is very quickly going to change, but these are not oftentimes very well known, even though they've developed so many sciences, modalities, psychotherapies have spun off of Carl Jung, Milton Erickson, the founder of hypnotherapy, as well as Jeffrey Wolf Green, the founder of Evolutionary Astrology, who is teaching through the decades, through the 70s, and speaking about many things that are commonly spoke about in today's era, but were very much rarely talked about and highly trailblazed by Jeffrey Green. In Jeffrey Green's system of evolutionary astrology, there are 3 distinct evolutionary stages of which every soul on the planet is within. And every soul on the planet is having particular experiences in order to learn and grow through those experiences. Everything is driven by the force, the necessity of evolution. Okay, and all of this can be found in Jeffrey Green's Magnus Open works, Pluto 1, and especially Pluto 2. This is some of the most valuable astrology books in existence. And it's not simply because this is telling us about astrology, planets, signs, PowerPoint presentations, aspects, all of that's inherent in it, but it is much more than just this as well. This is about understanding why our life is what it is and what we can do about it. How can we change the materials at hand? How do we actualize the potential of what we were born to be? This is what evolutionary astrology is all about. And it gives us a clear means of assessing our world, our culture, our species, and one another, where we are in our own personal evolution. And what's very important to understand is that there cannot be any better or worse. The same way there's a diversity of different plant species and animal species, within the human species, there's a whole diversity of different evolutionary stages. And this is beautiful. But generally, we are all evolving. And we are generally moving from one stage to the next, although this type of linear process can be misleading, and life is much more complex than any linear process. That said, we tend to learn the very best by comprehending a linear process. This is provided by Jeffrey Wolf Green in Evolutionary Astrology. The idea is that there are 3 principal evolutionary stages. The first stage, called consensus, rules roughly 3/4 of the population. What this simply means is 3/4 of the population has not evolved yet into recognizing each their own unique individuality. This is why oftentimes people with high awareness grow up and are teased by their peers out on recess as being weird. Weird, by the way, is a Celtic term you should look up if you ever received it in a derogatory way. I assure you, it's not derogatory as well. But for the 1/4 of the population that is not in the consensus, that 1/4 will seem weird to the majority of people. That is because the majority of people have not reached a level of self-awareness where they're really able to distinguish themselves, what's unique about themselves, versus the backdrop of expectation and obligation, first coming from their parents, teachers, bosses, the schools they go to. All of that becomes a measure of their success via the society we are unfortunately born into, which does not necessarily encourage creativity or innovation, as much as it encourages us simply following orders That is because the people that are creatives and inventors are few and far between. Out of the quarter population, there is an even smaller percentage which is quote unquote spiritualizing. It is very interesting that in these different chunks of evolutionary stages, you kind of get this pattern of repetition. For example, in early consensus, the very first stage of evolution, there is an orientation merely towards survival, having to keep up with the world around us. And such souls tend to exhibit tremendous amounts of fears and insecurities as they simply attempt to keep up with those that are around them. And there tends to be this unconscious, am I doing this right? Am I doing this right? Can I get pats on the back? Mommy, daddy, can you give me pats on the back? On a highly, highly unconscious level. Again, there's nothing wrong with this. The soul is learning to do just that. The soul is learning to function within society, to survive within the species. So this itself goes through a stage of individuation, where the soul discovers, I can offer this unique skill set back to the world, and the world likes that. Now, this does not mean that the soul has recognized who they are in their total uniqueness. They have found their way of surviving within society. In the final stage of consensus evolution, there is a spiritual stage where the soul is now attempting to offer themselves back to the world in a meaningful way, though they may not still comprehend who they are uniquely. Therefore, they may not know how to offer themselves back to the world in the most productive way. That being said, that's what they're learning to do. In many regards, religion as an institution is built to encourage such souls to discover this more meaningful way of relating to the world. But similarly, how churches will encourage everybody to hand around the money basket or to be a choir boy or this, that, the other thing, it's almost as if those things are encouraged as that's what you should be doing, which of course could be a total dishonoring of the uniqueness of the individual soul. There may be some people being a choir boy actualizes their deepest heart, their deepest creative potential. It brings them into ecstatic states, direct contact with God. That is their practice. That is their connection. And that is what we develop direct cultivation with as we individuate spiritually. But before we even get there, there's a whole phase of individuating that occurs between the consensus, what everyone else is doing, and the spiritual stage where we begin to form a direct contact with the source of all that is. There's a very in between here, which is the evolutionary phase of individuation itself. And souls in this phase tend to get very, very fed up with society's limiting expectations and obligations because the soul's already been confined in that for so long. So individuated souls can sometimes demonstrate tremendous frustration or anger or retaliation. They can become entirely anti-societal. They can become entirely anti-church, punk, fight back, and they can tend to isolate themselves from the status quo. That in and of itself is the quality, the process, the mechanism of individuation. It is separation from the status quo. And that can be such an enormous chapter that can go in so many different directions in and of itself. There's ways we can go into over-glamorization of shutting down society or shutting down religion, and it's all iconoclasm and burning things to the ground to the point of just pure unnecessary. And at the same time, this very well could be necessary, depending on context, depending on circumstance. The individuated stage is about breaking free from oppression, breaking free from the oppression of societal chains, just as there were chains of the caste system in India. There were untouchables, and there were African slaves all over the northern and southern Americas. And we would love to believe that we have evolved beyond such prejudices and cultural divides, and this is absolutely not the case. It is so important for us to recognize that every single soul is completely unique, and this type of assessment on total outward things comes only from consensus consciousness. It does not come from anybody who has actualized their own individuality. Because, of course, if you actualize your own individuality, you will recognize you are unlike anybody else. And if you can so clearly recognize yourself as different than anybody, you can see that this will be true for all others as well. Love is learning to respect the otherness of others. Love is learning to respect ourselves, so that way the otherness of others does not extinguish the otherness of us. The individuated stage of consciousness is all about lifetime after lifetime of experiences. So to come out of hive mind programming, and at the same time to come out of senseless rebellion that leads to ostracization, sacrifice, or just ending up causing more harm than good. At the final stages of individuated, souls can become fully aware of their human nature and make brilliant discoveries that can be offered back to the rest of humanity, that can save, improve, forever change the course of history, thanks to one individual's ingenuity. The archetype is Uranus, ruling the evolutionary phase of individuation. Now, as the soul enters into the spiritual stage, this is where there can be many, many misconceptions and confusion, especially when people get all topically judgmental as if spirituality is what you sound like and dress like on the surface. I don't think so. Religion has so much to do with dressing the same, acting the same, repeating the same exact lines, which is not honoring individuality. Spiritual evolution is the journey of total individuality, discovering its unique function, which can then therefore be offered back to the greater whole. This is sacrifice that is natural, healthy, and fulfilling, as opposed to the deranged fake sacrifice, which is all too common in the consensus stage, where people bend themselves all out of shape to meet other people's expectations, what mom and dad expect us to be, what spouse or partner expects us to be, and we lose our individuality. Spiritual evolution is about liberating our total individuality, and then through that liberation, discovering how each person is made as an instrument to commit back to the collective. That is the only way we gain ultimate satisfaction. So even the souls that we see out there making a bunch of money, vacation lives until the day that they die, are not truly in a spiritual stage of evolution. They're not actually achieving the level of happiness that they could be, so they're living lifetimes of spending money frivolously and being miserable, so that way when they have their life review, they can come back and do it differently. This is the truth for each and every one of us. As many of us may like to believe that this is our last lifetime, and whenever anybody brings that up, it always brings a little chuckle along for me. In the spiritual stage of evolution, there is also a consensus, individuated, and a final spiritualized stage. The final spiritualized stage is so beyond our comprehension, we might as well pretend that we can't understand it. Unless you're already walking on water, unless you're already raising people from the dead, then I would be very interested to hear more of your thoughts on third stage spiritual evolution. The vast majority of souls tuning into these videos are third stage individuated, first stage spiritual, and very, very rare are souls just evolving into the second stage, or potentially a few moving along the second stage. Those would be the folks I probably hear from the least, so it's a little bit hard to assess. This is one of the main points I want to bring up here, now, and in this video. The intentions of me being on YouTube is not merely just to teach astrology. There's actually a number of intentions going on through these videos, which is why I may do talks like this that don't really go into technical astrology. Although, once again, evolutionary astrology is not just stars, planets, and cycles. Evolutionary astrology is an extraordinarily cohesive psychotherapy and ontology. So to comprehend each of our own lives, it gets clearer and clearer to the point where most people wouldn't believe it's even possible to have the level of clarity that you certainly can, and evolutionary astrology will take you there. Now, in the first stage of spiritual, souls are realizing that they have a connection to the whole, that they want to return to that whole, that they want to feel love, be full of love, love one another, to return to what the essence of life is inherently about, to be a divine dance, even the ups and the downs being a part of this overall symphony. And when it comes to spiritual evolution, is there any one path? Is there any one yoga? Is there any one chakra? Absolutely not. As we evolve spiritually, so we individuate. And this is probably one of the most missing and needed things in the whole world of spirituality. Spirituality is still being trampled upon by religion. Religion is not designed to encourage individuality. Most religion is actually designed to stamp individuality out. We can get all conspiracy theory and woo-woo and spooky ghost under the bed stories as we want to. I prefer not to. What happened as a result of human stupidity is man-made religion was designed to prevent humans from evolving beyond a certain stage. The first stage of spiritual evolution is where we realize that in order to form a greater heart, be more supportive and loving one another, we need to eliminate our egos. We need to stop thinking about all these trivial things that actually isn't so much us, you have to understand. It's the world. It's the conditioning we receive from our parents, from our teachers, from our bosses that created this quote-unquote ego that makes us anxious and secure, like I can't relax, I can't meditate, I've got things to do. So let's be clear here. This is conditioning. And what the ego is more of our uniqueness, not something to throw away, but something to discover by throwing away the clutter, by throwing away the interferences most of us, much like sponges, have absorbed throughout our life. So the individuation phase is what about cutting all that crap out? Again, there's a lot of rejection involved when it comes to the planet Uranus, who rules all individuation. I don't think so. I'm not really a part of this. Something sets me off a little bit about this. Now I'm going to provide, I think, some of the most cutting-edge information I can share. Again, my intentions is not merely to just tell you the astrology every day, like it's when to do your laundry type of weekend. When I do your birth charts, it's going to go much, much deeper than when you're going to find your next partner or, when you're going to get your next job. Sure, we can talk about those things too, but you betcha we're going to talk about what and why is your life, the experiences that you've had, what and why, because all of that has shaped you into being the unique individual that you are. Now, I decided not to name names. I decided not to name institutions. But religion has a function, which is to attempt to preserve the essence of whatever the religion is attempting to honor. I say it that way because I have discovered no religious institutions that really honors the essence, as opposed to creating man-made rules that prevents human beings from going beyond a certain stage of evolution, specifically the first stage of evolution into the second stage of spiritual evolution. In the first stage of spiritual evolution, the soul is discovering its interconnectivity with all that is. That first discovery I like to phrase as the honeymoon phase. It is exciting. It's like being on psychedelics all the time. People in this phase tend to come off very annoying to everybody else because they're tugging on everyone's shirt corner, telling everybody this is what you need to do to wake up, and you can wake up, and everything is love, and we're all in this together, and everyone's like, yeah, we already kind of get that, because kind of everybody does. This is actually a very specific stage of spiritual evolution that occurs just before entering into second stage, as the soul has to actually exhaust and eliminate all of these things. I'm going to run through the village screaming that I'm enlightened and everybody can be enlightened, and the poor fool gets put in the stocks, That represents a specific stage of evolution. We would love to turn everybody on to what specifically works for us, and it doesn't work, and we get humbling experience after humbling experience after humbling experience. Sometimes this causes us to become enormously isolated within our religious cults. Oh, well, here's the only other people who think the same way I do. And oh, these are the people that dress the same way I want to dress. And you know what? I've been in temples, all sorts of temples, not just one religion. all the main religions. And this is something that's shared. It is a spiritual, but also very dangerous realm when you are intentionally dissolving individuality, which is why priests dress the same, which is why monks dress the same, which is why there's so much similarity in the rituals and everyone shaves their head. Why does that happen is to eliminate your individuality. That, at a certain stage of evolution, is not wrong. That's how we cut cords with the whole bullshit old identity. We thought we knew who we were. We don't know who we are. So we shave our head. We start to follow in line with the others. We start to contemplate on the bigger questions. And this is not at all where it ends. This is a huge misconception, is that you spiritualize, you join the cult, you join the whatever it may be, and then you meet your guru. And then you die and your guru takes you to heaven. And there is a whole phase of individuation that's not being acknowledged here. In fact, I've read the texts, all sorts of texts, not just Western, not just Eastern, and boy, do they really parallel one another. I grew up Christian, hard puritanical, having to attend a Roman Catholic cold church every weekend till I was 16. Doesn't that really come through? And then I repeated that whole religious education through being a Hare Krishna, super, super, super devout for so many years. Learned so many brilliant things, so many jewels and treasures and personalities that I could never possibly forget or eliminate, no matter how much I tried. And I've experienced every single horror story. Shocking, unbelievable. Why? Because people need to give away their individuality, and along with it, all of your belongings, and ruin your family and ruin your relationship. We need individuation within relationship. Not one person's the head, one person's the ass. We need individuation within churches. We need individuation within monasteries and all these places. Now in India, the culture tends to be extremely spiritually evolved. Has been around forever, has developed systems for everything. So those in individuated spiritual consciousness are not necessarily thrown out the bus. They still can be. That's a part of the evolution of someone in second stage spiritual. Is there's a massive experience of isolation as you drift away from the community, the cult, the religion, where everybody's happy, repeating the same things again and again. The individuated soul at the early stages of second stage individuated starts to begin to have a crisis as they realize that their heart, their way of connecting to God, is not the same as everybody else. Now, speaking of the Hare Krishnas, one of my favorite books that's not mentioned quite enough, because again, it's very funny what books religious institutions are going to emphasize versus what books they could emphasize, and why don't they? Is there like these agendas or something to keep people out of power? I think so. The priestly class has designed itself through religion and the repetition and preservation of these weird traditions to keep people stagnant and unevolved and not going towards individuated spiritual consciousness, but rather remaining ever imprisoned and entrapped in first stage spiritual, so that way the spiritual class can claim supremacy to themselves and claim that all of the practitioners need to go through the priest in order to go to God, which is, of course, total horseshit. This is a real way to evaluate who's a true guru, because the true guru, we're not even going to pretend that we can comprehend because of how evolved they are. They are indeed God, man, woman, inconceivable, but God in human form is a big deal. Jesus Christ is a big deal because we had a God in human form who was crucified on behalf of humans with a heart of compassion while saying, forgive them, they know not what they do. So that's why Jesus is special. There's lots of gurus. That's a special guru who has performed a very specific and special function, which is why we honor Jesus cross-culturally. Everybody knows Jesus. Neem Karoli Baba, Indian saint. He used to talk about Jesus with his Indian followers more than other Hindu saints intentionally. You know, we're trying to get to the essence of what is beyond the rules, the garb, the structures. That falls away as we enter into individuated spiritual consciousness. What tends to happen when souls enter second stage spiritual consciousness is they realize that doing things differently, going against the grain, can work for them. Then they might recognize where they're special as opposed to the group, and potentially even make discoveries where now they have new powers or new perspectives or new capabilities different from the rest of the cult or the community. Now, this can backfire in all sorts of different ways. The person who's reckoning themselves as different can easily become ostracized by the group, shadow projected upon as being dark, mean, power hungry. This can lead that person to forming all sorts of distorted self-image, and they have the potential of going off on that deep end. Souls, specifically in the second stage, individuated of spiritual consciousness, are also learning very much about good and evil. They're going to probably attract highly manipulative, sadistic people into their field to learn about how is this possible and who is God and how is all of this created and how do we handle this in very unique ways, as again we're evolving into our individual nature that's going to be different than everyone's else. The book I mentioned, Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, is a book all about each individual cultivating a highly unique and personal relationship with God. And that's an amazing book. That's not something you hear about, talked about in too many spiritual circles, despite this book being thousands of years old, even within the circles that carry on these traditions. This is like a heart gem that is so treasured, but not oftentimes talked about, because we're supposed to talk about the same old things for the consensus spiritual, like meditate and do your japa and be a good person and dress this way and act this way, and it is helpful at first until it no longer is, just like training wheels. And when those training wheels fall off, it does get a little bit more scary, because it's not you and them, you and a priest, it's you and God. And the more that you evolve through individual spiritual evolution, it does become increasingly lonelier. And there are challenges which become increasingly tougher as the soul is learning what good and evil is, and God's relationship to good and evil, and how we as highly unique individuals can use our own powers. As we develop personal connection to God, God starts to interact with us more and more personally. And even if we don't ask for cities, cities sometimes come. That means powers. See, this is a whole dichotomy that's not being talked about out there in this New Age community. I know it's not. That's part of why I'm talking about this now. There's these misconceptions such as you must choose love or you choose power. What happens if you evolve, become more and more loving, surrender to God? He or she will give you powers anyways. You don't have to ask for those. Many souls in spiritual stage of evolution are having these experiences of disillusionment. They may go through necessary periods of believing something that is not true, experience a crisis and then a period of disillusionment in order to get back on track with what is true. This again will be a highly unique and individual journey for each and every person. We have to find what is true for us. We have to find what our unique spiritual service or function is that we were born to be, not necessarily one that was laid out in an instruction manual. So this is something to bear in mind when we go through our periods of disillusionment, which I believe can be some of the most challenging to experience, because we form this overall orientation to life that gives us a deep sense of meaning, that can fill us up to the depth of our bones, and then we hit a confusion, or we hit something that dismantles or disproves so much of what we just believed in. And sometimes people have to go denial and be crazy, and it may encourage us to evaluate things and see what were the parts that were true and were working and were very helpful, and where are the parts that I need to go off and do something different that's on my own. It is generally understood and accepted that we will all evolve into a stage of no longer depending on outer provisions such as church doctrine, rituals, belief systems that are already pre-concocted and handed down to us from others. It's not that we can't continue to use those things, as so many of the gods, the archetypes, and the storylines are true. So there's still truth in religion. There's truth in all of these parts and pieces, but it is in truth that continues to evolve. And it evolves through an organic, real, interpersonal connection between the individual and God, which will be highly unique. The person's spiritual practices, ways of attuning, ways of experiencing God will be as unique as each individual soul. This is the symbolism of the Rasa Leela dance, where Krishna, who is the symbol of God, duplicates himself with circles on top of concentric circles of gopis, who are considered to be the individual souls. And Krishna dances with each gopi completely uniquely, but how each gopi most deeply desires in her heart. Similarly, our soul is a fractal. We are discovering this extraordinarily unique and infinitely deep nature that we are, and how to honor that, and how to liberate that, and how to ultimately give that back to the greater whole through honoring our own spiritual connection, our own spiritual process, by trusting. It's not the same as just hearing voices in our head or being on a mission from God. It's having the actual resources to do what we otherwise could not do. Bring forth new healing modalities, new teachings that can affect tens of thousands of people, that can take the whole world out of hellish dimensions and bring them into more heavenly dimensions. We as individual human beings do contain this power. By keeping our hearts open and online, but also not settling for what is limiting, restrictive, or oppressive to this profoundly deep heart, then we can best actualize our gifts to be celebrated by both us, humanity, and you could say God. Spiritual is going to ultimately and inevitably invite us to step up into our highest integrity, our highest potential, which will be unique for us. What will work for us will not be the same as what works for others. What may work for us may damn well break the rules as what others thinks is the way it should go. This is how we're going to break into a whole new way of relating to one another as a species, where we're developing a profound new level of respect for each to go their own way, to cultivate each their own unique relationship with God. Once we start to get into that, it only becomes increasingly more surreal, increasingly more magical, increasingly more symbolic, as archetypal resonance, coincidence, and divine timing begins to align on itself again and again and again, not necessarily becoming easier, not necessarily becoming like now life is on a vacation, but understanding who we are, what we are, and why we would want to have the unique experiences that we do to shape us into holding the gifts, talents, and potential that we do. Be individuals, my friends. We can be nice, we can be kind, we can be compassionate, and we can be considerate. But do not be too considerate to the point of losing ourselves to over passivity. The world is not going to decide for us who we are to be. That is for our own unfolding and self-discovery.